So, here we all are, the last chapter of the book. Do you remember how chapter 16 ended? They were a terrible battle. Remember, Peter was fighting the great witch, and then Aslan and his team came pouring in, and Aslan roared, then he attacked the white witch. And that's kind of how it ended. Chapter 17, the hunting of the white stag. The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or they took to flight. They took off running. The next thing Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone right and left, but nothing would stop Edmund. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly and simply getting made a statue out of it himself. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance if we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded, though, Edmund was. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver, a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, his mouth was open, and his face was a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that she had been given for a Christmas present. Remember, it was she thought it was a glass vial, but it was really made of diamond. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and then poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice. "Others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded, while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she'd seen him for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He now was becoming his old, real self again, and could look you in the face. And there, on the field of battle, Aslan dubbed him a knight. He made him into a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush, no, of course not," said Susan. "Well, oughtn't he be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, of course not," surely not, said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if you were he." And you remember what the arrangement was that the lion had made with the witch, don't you? The lion had agreed to let Edmund go free if the witch was allowed to kill Aslan. Remember that? A horrible, horrible part of the book. But that's how Edmund was still alive, is because Aslan died in his place. "All the same, I think he ought to know," said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept right where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know, but somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock at night. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river. And the next day after that, at around tea time, after hiking all down the river, they actually reached the mouth of the river at the ocean. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. In front of them were the sands with rocks and a little pool of salt water and seaweed and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. Have you ever smelled the ocean? It's quite a unique smell, isn't it? And the cry of the seagulls, have you heard them? Can you just imagine them now, their cry is on the ocean? Can you remember it? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again, and they took their shoes and socks off, and they felt the sand between their toes. I love that feeling, do you? But the next day was a more solemn day, for then, in the great hall of Cair-Paravel, that wonderful hall with ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock feathers and the eastern door which looks out towards the sea, in the presence of all their friends and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the 4 thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. Bear it well, sons of Adam. Bear it well, daughters of Eve, said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends. To Tumnus the fawn. Remember how he helped Lucy at the beginning of the story? And they gave rewards to the beavers. Remember how the beavers helped the children? And Giant Rumblebuffin, and more rewards to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarves, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair-Paravel, with revelry and partying and dancing, and gold was flashed and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music outside from the sea people. But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it, for Mr. Beaver had warned them. He'll be coming and going, he had said. One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, you know, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not like a tame lion. And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here, a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf one month and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out, and they made good laws for the country and kept the peace, and they saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and they liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school. And they generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who just wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort than from Giant Rumblebuffin. They were found on the north shore of Narnia when these ventured across the frontier. And they entered into friendships and alliances with countries beyond the sea and paid them visits of state, and they also received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew, the 4 children, and changed as the years passed over them. And Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage, and she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and he was great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always cheerful and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. And so they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was by now a middle-aged faun and beginning to be rather stout, he came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in these parts. The white stag, that's a male deer, right? A buck. The white stag had once more appeared, and he would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a-hunting with horses and horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they sighted him, and he led them a great pace, great speed over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, until the horses of all the courtiers were tired out and only the 4 kings and queens were still following. And when they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow, then King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for a long time, "I say, fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so let us do." So they alighted from their horses and tied them to the trees and went on into the thick wood on foot, and as soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron." "Madam," said King Edmund, "if you look well upon it, you shall see it to be a pillar of iron with a lantern set on the top thereof." "By the lion's maid, a strange device," said King Peter, "to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it, and so high above it, that if it were lit, it should give light to no man." "Sir," said Queen Lucy, "by likelihood, when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in the place, or fewer, or none, possibly. For this is a young woods, and the iron post is old." And they stood looking upon it. Then said King Edmund, "I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like before, as if it were a dream, or in the dream of a dream." "Sir," answered they all, "it is even so with us as well." "And more," said Queen Lucy, "for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some other great change on our fortunes." "Madam," said King Edmund, "the like foreboding stirreth in my heart also." "And in mine, fair brother," said King Peter. "And in mine too," said Queen Susan, "wherefore by my counsel we shall lightly return to our horses and follow this white stag no further." "Madam," said King Peter, "therein I pray thee to have me excused, for never since we 4 were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hand to any high matter as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over and given up. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved." "Sister," said Queen Lucy, "my royal brother speaketh rightly, and it seemed to me that we should be ashamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turned back from following so noble a beast as we now have in chase." "And so say I," said King Edmund, "and I have such desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewel in all Narnia and all the islands." "Then in the name of Aslan," said Queen Susan, "if ye all will have it so, let us go on and take the adventure that shall fall to us." And so these kings and queens, speaking rather funny now that they've been kings and queens for so long, they entered the thicket. And before they had gone 20 steps, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post. And before they had gone 20 more steps, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And the next moment they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room. And they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting clothes, but they were just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. And it was the very same day and the very same hour of the same day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide from Mrs. Macready. And Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the hallway, but luckily they never came into this empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, you probably remember that, didn't tell him not to be silly or not to tell lies, but he believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get to the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be much use by now if you did. Eh, what's that? Oh yes, of course you'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it, and don't talk too much about it even amongst yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find that they've had adventures of the same sort themselves. Sorry, what's that? Oh, how will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd thing, they say. Even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach children in school these days? The professor added. And that, my friends, is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. Thank you all so much for joining me. We'll start with book 2 tomorrow. Okay, have a good evening.